So welcome to everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. We are starting a couple minutes late, and I know that we have a good number still filing in or joining, and they will join in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. My pleasure and privilege to welcome today Frank Fukuyama and Philip Zelikow. Frank from Stanford, a co-founder of American Purpose and chair of our editorial board. Philip Zelikow from the University of Virginia, the executive director in the day of the 9/11 Commission, and someone who is now leading an effort to create or establish a commission devoted to better understanding what's happened and is happening with the pandemic and COVID-19. It seems to me, you all, that in times like these, as they say, one really does need the best minds and also deep experience. I actually truly believe that. And in our guests of honor, Frank and Philip, we have two people who have experience in government, outside government, as academics, as scholars, as policy writers, essayists, authors of books. This is really the creme de la creme, managing in this next 60 minutes tough issues. The way we're going to do it is Frank is going to take the chair. He's going to lead a conversation with Philip the first half or so. When they're concluded, Frank will pass it back to me. I will call on people. We'll have a good conversation. Hard stop, 1 p.m. Eastern. But thanks everybody for making time. Philip, welcome. And Frank, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. So it's great to see Philip on this session. He and I most recently were engaged in a conspiracy to reform the way that public policy is taught in policy schools. But we go back much further than that. I think that, in the last couple of weeks, I and many of the people that I know have actually been scrambling around trying to desperately do something to help the Afghans we know get out of the country. I know that Jeff has also been involved in that with the RFERL staff that's there and so forth. And, it's produced a lot of anguish, first and foremost for those Afghans, but also for, anybody that was involved in that project over the last 20 years. It was interesting watching Biden's speech yesterday. I actually thought that it was effective in many ways and, presented actually a serious argument. And I also have this suspicion that he has his finger on the pulse of the country better than people like us do. I and many of the people I know actually were involved with Afghanistan, have Afghan friends and so forth. And so it might seem like, the most urgent moral problem right now, but vast majority of Americans don't. And we'll have to see in time whether politically his was the, wiser position or not. But in any event, that's something that we can get into. So Phil, the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, that commission reported some time ago. A lot of water has flowed under the bridge since then. So maybe you could reflect on its work and how you see, the lessons of 9/11 having evolved over the, years, and particularly in light of what's happened in the past month.
Sure, thank you, Frank. I think the news is gets people down. We're in the midst of a pandemic that's beating up our society. We've just had this terrible last 2 weeks of events in Afghanistan. And then here it seems like, oh no, and now we have to relive all the clips of the horror of 9/11 one more time. So what I'd like to do actually is present the 9/11 Commission as actually a story of American success. Look, here's what happened. The country underwent a terrible mass trauma, huge tragedy. And in response to that tragedy, the country did this is a government agency that was created, a short-lived government agency, that then did a serious, unflinching examination of the crisis, what happened and why, including the foreign side of it, including understanding the world of Al-Qaeda, not just the American side of it. Then took stock of the crisis, used that to develop a good, solid foundational narrative of what happened and why, all organized by the government. Immediately passed legislation to enact all sorts of reforms, but more deeply, with that, armed with that understanding of the crisis, contributed to a major revamp of our counterterrorism defenses that have successfully protected America from a major violent extremist attack for the last 20 years. So that mass trauma, huge tragedy, the government organized itself to examine what happened, report, armed with that understanding, took a series of, and other things, took a series of measures that then made the country safer. So in a period when Americans despair that their government can do anything right, and the 9/11 story has its stories of errors and missed opportunities, I think it's worth reflecting a little bit on the 9/11 Commission experience itself as something the government did do right. The counterterrorism efforts of the United States over the last 20 years have been reasonably successful by, I think, almost, if you had told people in October 2001 that they will enact policies that for 20 years will protect America from another major attack by violent Islamist extremists, they would have regarded that as the upper boundary of the plausible scenario for success of American government policy. So it's just worth, perhaps, because I have nothing to add to the chorus of doom and gloom, but I think it is worth at least countering that chorus a little bit with noticing what the government did well, and actually what a great many people working in the public sector have done well for 20 years.
So, Phil, I wonder if you could reflect on, a different question, which is the underlying threat that the United States faced. I remember, so I was at SICE when the September 11th attacks happened. We watched the smoke coming up from the Pentagon from our office windows, and then we spent the next 9 months, in this frenzy, thinking through, well, okay, if Osama bin Laden could kill 3,000 Americans, he could kill 300,000 or 3 million Americans if he could get his hand on a nuclear weapon. And it justified, some very extreme countermeasures in order to protect us. But I would say that, the actual threat, so clearly we took measures to protect ourselves, which were very important, but it would also seem that the threat that we believed that we faced in those early months really never materialized. But maybe you could reflect a little bit on that, and then what it means for, U.S. foreign policy.
No, almost all my undergraduate students now were not born when 9/11 happened. 9/11, therefore, to them is historical memory. It's kind of like the way Pearl Harbor was for many of the people on this who were on this conference. Is we were aware that this was a searing traumatic memory. And I contend that actually 9/11 was more traumatic and searing than Pearl Harbor. It came closer to the heart of the United States politics and culture. The memory of it was searing for tens of millions of Americans, literally in the physical vicinity of where the attacks had occurred. The saturation of the tragedy on media and so forth. So as bad as that was, and now very hard to recover that. Also very hard to recover is, which Frank you were trying to do, is the atmosphere of the drumbeat of threat and anxiety that persisted for months after 9/11. We've mostly forgotten now, but in the next month we had the anthrax attacks. we later discovered that the anthrax attacks emanated actually from probably from a disgruntled scientist inside the United States, but it took quite a long time for that understanding to emerge. And at the time, it just added a whole new dimension of hysteria to the drumbeat. And what happened in the intelligence community is that where before they had sifted out all kinds of threats and alarms and warnings and not bothered the president with the stuff that didn't seem too credible, the CYA instinct was, you know what, we're just going to give the president every one of these things. So they did a thing called the threat matrix. And so every single morning, day in and day out, they would open the president's day with a whole nerve-jangling repertory of reported threats. And that went on day after day for months, in a period when CIA was also propagating the story it had heard from a Czech intelligence service about a possible Iraqi connection to 9/11, an argument that then CIA withdrew, but didn't withdraw until months later, mainly turning on FBI investigation, actually, and so on. So you have this tremendous atmosphere in which the threat actually became outsized. Of course, the whole reason for the attack on America was bin Laden's effort to turn himself and al-Qaeda into the semblance of a world historical force, which they were not. It was an effort to exaggerate their importance through an incredible example of the propaganda of the deed, to borrow the slogan used by 19th century anarchists. This was always a marginal movement, even inside the Muslim world, that grew up in one of these wilderness areas in the Muslim world, which happened to be war-torn Afghanistan in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So there was a sense in which there was an exaggerated notion of the threat, an exaggerated notion of Islamofascism as if it were a world historical force comparable to Nazism or Soviet communism, which it was not and is not. There are long-standing wars that have been tearing apart Islam's world, but this particular faction is not the dominant force in those wars, and doesn't represent most Muslims. So you have this tremendous atmosphere of anxiety that now is hard to recapture. Part of what the 9/11 Commission was meant to do was to help right-size the whole thing and put it into proper proportion simply by understanding what had happened and getting kind of a good, careful, balanced appraisal of the tremendously disproportionate damage done by what amounted to less than a platoon of people with a budget of about $500,000. I mean, this just trivially sized operation. And then a story in which it became clear that what we really needed was a whole series of layered defenses against this sort of extreme viral threat, which we then proceeded to create stage by stage. The subsequent parallel histories of the invasion of Afghanistan, then the invasion of Iraq, are parallel important stories, but it shouldn't obscure kind of the basic core narrative of this peculiar period of threat and response to that threat over time.
Yeah, I really vividly remember that period, sitting in these meetings where we'd go over the gas pipeline system in the United States and realize how completely unprotected it was, and if somebody really wanted to do major damage, how relatively easy it would be to do something. So maybe I could get you off of the defensive responses, because in my view, what really changed the world was the American overreaction. Oh, by the way, I have a old colleague from my RAND days, Brian Jenkins, who's one of the country's leading experts on terrorism. And he's said right from the beginning exactly what you just said, that the real problem with terrorism is that people take it too seriously. that for some reason it's a kind of political theater that triggers people's emotions, and it always leads to this big overreaction. And I would say that the defensive measures that you spoke about were perfectly necessary and legitimate, but that's not all we did. And in fact, the national security strategy that the Bush administration issued before the invasion of Iraq basically was making an argument in favor of not preemptive war, but preventive war, that given the possibility of terrorists, getting their hands on nuclear weapons, you had to go out and actively subdue those threats. So in light of everything that's happened, I think we can probably agree that Iraq was not the high point of American, foreign policy. But maybe, focusing more on Afghanistan, if you could reflect a little bit on whether that, active measure, how justified was it? Where were the mistakes? Because that's really what everybody's been debating in the last couple of weeks.
Sure, glad to talk about that. Like you, I've spent some time in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, so this is not a perfectly, abstract, remote part of the world for me. My first visit to Afghanistan was in October of 2003, actually doing 9/11 Commission-related work, and I spent time in Kandahar and Bagram and Kabul. But then, actually, I went from Kabul to Peshawar and spent time in Peshawar, which is of course now is an absolute no-go zone for Americans, but just gives you some sense of how permissive the environment was back then. I went then from Peshawar on to Islamabad, but the point is there were years in which the environment in Afghanistan was relatively easy and welcoming, as long as the foreigners didn't settle in too deeply. It's a little bit ironic that some of the initial commentary has called attention to the vanity of American nation building. When if you spent time in Afghanistan in these early years, of course, the dominant theme among people working in Afghanistan was that America was not paying any attention to it and was neglecting any nation building. So it wasn't so much that we had this fantastically vain and quixotic project, which then foundered. You can have an argument that maybe we should have tried some sort of significant project. Actually, the dominant theme was a desire not to care at all about the governance and security of Afghanistan. There were some significant human development efforts in areas like electricity, education, public health, which made a huge difference. But security and governance were by and large entirely neglected. It wasn't the failure of a grand design. There were no grand designs. In fact, we didn't even provide significant funding to build Afghan security forces. And so we made no investment in either a foreign or domestic security presence in the rural areas for years. So while we treated all Taliban as if they were an undifferentiated enemy, without understanding all the factions and differences between them, and actually even vetoed Karzai's efforts to effect some Afghan reconciliation in those early years. So, basically creating more enemies and at the same time not doing anything to build up security was not a good combination. My own view is that the United States could and should have completely gotten out of Afghanistan in the early 2010s at the latest. And should have gotten out probably in 2013, 2014. Why do I pick those dates? People forget this was a period in which Hamid Karzai was the president. He was refusing to sign a treaty to ensure the continued presence of American forces in Afghanistan. Obama wanted to cut American forces down radically and was contemplating a zero option. Karzai refused to sign a treaty in which the Americans could continue their presence because he was playing up his role as the Afghan nationalist and treating the Americans increasingly as a hostile presence. In my view, the United States government should have welcomed this stance from Karzai, should thank you very much. We are impressed by your Afghan nationalism. We believe Afghans should indeed control their own destiny, and let's work on an orderly withdrawal. The counter argument, of course, is, well, the need to protect against terrorism. So then you have to step back and take a global view of what was the international Islamist extremist terrorist threat in 2013. Where was that threat globally in 2013? And by the way, this analysis is even more true today. In 2013, number 1, number 2, and number 3 were Syria, Syria, Syria. You can add in northern Iraq. The most serious terrorist attacks that have occurred anywhere in the West in the last 10 years have occurred in Western Europe, in Paris and Brussels, between 2014 and 2016, organized entirely from Syria, with mainly by French and Belgian citizens who trained in Syria. Now today, back then and today, if you said, well, what else would be high on the list? And you looked at where are the largest groups of Islamist extremists operating in wilderness areas, the next answer would be Africa. Africa. From the Sahel all the way into East Africa, including northern Mozambique, where thousands of Islamist extremists are currently operating. Now, we can then have an argument, yes, but they don't care about the United States. They're just involved in local fights. And I think that substantially is right. We have no regional strategy for what to do there. Oh, and by the way, the United States is a bit player in Africa compared to the Europeans. We deride the Europeans as not being world leaders, but when it comes to this struggle in Africa, or by the way, in the entire Mediterranean world and North Africa, it's the Europeans who are in the lead and who are carrying most of the brunt and cost of countering Islamist extremism. And by the way, the migrant crisis being caused by Islam's continuing wars. Now, I say all this to put Afghanistan in perspective. Even if, for instance, you decided that we're very worried about the Islamic State Khorasan, which carried out this attack on our airfield. An attack, by the way, that would have been impossible except for the extreme circumstances at the airfield where we did not have our usual base security set up in place because with the HESCO barriers and other checkpoints that we always establish at our bases, but which we could not set up at that airport, which is what made that attack possible for ISK. But suppose we wanted to get after ISK. No, we would have to get in line. Get in line. The Taliban and ISK are deadly enemies. The first thing the Taliban did when they came into Kabul is they went to the jail cell where the Afghans were holding a leader of the ISK, dragged him out of his cell and shot him. Really like one of the very first things they did in Kabul. So not only is the Taliban the deadly enemy of the ISK, but so is every single neighboring country to Afghanistan. Every one of those countries, Pakistan, China, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Iran, all regard the ISK as deadly enemies. So then you ask yourself, what is it exactly the United States adds to the ability of the Taliban and every single neighboring country to fight that particular terrorist group? Including the Russians helping as well. So then if you ask yourself, then where would the United States devote its global energies if we are concerned about violent Islamism and where we think we can make a real difference with a comparative advantage? Afghanistan is probably not the answer to that question. There are other regions of the world that could command somewhat more attention if we had coherent regional strategies for those parts of the world. By the way, I'll add that Islam's wars are fundamentally about opportunity and the search for justice in repressive societies. It would be nice for the United States to join with others to adopt strategies to address those core problems. I flag that, Frank, because this is something you've had your eye on all along. as to how to help these countries get at their core problems. And I think that's where the United States government also needs to focus its energy, of which, by the way, right now, the pandemic is probably number one.
Right. So I just want to raise one other issue. It certainly would have been possible to get out in 2013 after the surge, but there was an even earlier point. I wrote about this in the latest blog post that I posted on the American Purpose website. There was a fundamental choice that we could have made right after the fall of the Taliban, back at the time of the Bonn Conference and the constitutional Loya Jirga, where we decided on wanting to actually create a state, a centralized state. And actually, the constitution of Afghanistan that came out of that constitutional Loya Jirga is very centralized. I mean, the president gets to appoint all the provincial governors. There's really no local autonomy and so forth. And that reflected desires of the Afghans themselves. Now, when I arrived at Stanford back in 2010, there's a really fascinating seminar that was led by Steve Krasner and Carl Eichenberry. So Carl had been the ISAF commander for a number of years and then the American ambassador to Kabul. And the question that we were debating then was whether there actually was an alternative to trying to create a state in Afghanistan, which would have been, basically a warlord coalition. You build on the Northern Alliance and you get, friendly warlords to, agree that they're going to keep Al-Qaeda out, but basically, not try to have a state with an army and a police and a monopoly of legitimate force and everything that goes along with the state. I actually think that wasn't such a great alternative back then because, the Afghans love fighting each other. And I think any kind of warlord coalition would have been, itself quite unstable, and it would not have guaranteed that the Taliban or Al-Qaeda would not return. But that's what then launched us into this long-term state building project. And this is where I really get quite annoyed at some of the commentary because, people like Maureen Dowd were saying we were trying to build Jeffersonian democracy there, which is just ridiculous.
No,
I think that we were trying to create some kind of a minimal state. We accepted the fact that it was going to be, corrupt and ineffective, but we saw that as the major alternative to a more chaotic situation that could fall back into civil war and that could then lead to the reintroduction of, really dangerous groups. But I wonder whether you think there was an opportunity for an alternative policy, well before 2013.
Oh, yes. Look, if you looked at the trajectory of Afghan history, here's the deal. It's the basic grand bargain that that the Afghans had struck up until the revolutions and counter-revolutions of 1978 and 1979 that led to the Soviet invasion. The basic deal that had kept the peace in Afghanistan was this. The central government will rule in Kabul, and it will pretend to be all-powerful. Everybody else in the country will act as if the central government is for real, even though it's mostly a Potemkin government everywhere else. And each side agrees to more or less leave the others alone. So on the surface, it would have looked like Afghanistan had a strong central government and a central army. And basically it consisted of Kabul and the army under the monarchy. And there were ways to but the basic deal that kept the country together is each side, more or less, the rural areas and the urban center agreed to more or less not interfere too much with each other. Now, what happened then is you create a nominal central government again in the constitution that was created by the Afghans after the Taliban were thrown out. But the United States would not let the Afghans do a reconciliation with the Taliban, whom we regarded as all homogeneous and hostile, which was not an accurate depiction of the situation. You had a leader of Afghanistan who actually didn't care anything very much about the Afghan army because the Tajiks ran the army and Karzai was a Pashtun and he didn't care too much about that. He was interested in political reconciliation. But you then had a lot of interference in the rural areas, especially through counterterrorism missions. And you made no investment in rural security of any kind. So the result then was that over time, you're funneling a lot of money into the country that's being siphoned off for corruption. The central government is intrusive in annoying ways and also seen as corrupt and backed by foreigners. You're not building good bases of support in the rural areas that can provide their own security. And you're waging war in an undifferentiated way against the Taliban, which has a neighboring host country in Pakistan and has a complete sanctuary to plan its return. It took years for them to rebuild, but they had the years to do it. And we didn't really kind of find a more stable way of rebuilding Afghanistan and restoring the basic social contract that had kept the peace in that country in the years before revolution and war had torn it apart.
Right. Well, we'll have to see whether, having withdrawn, we can actually reestablish a relation with the Taliban regime. I mean, it sounds like there was some on-the-ground cooperation, right around the airport, and there's some signs that that might be.
Well, and the Taliban and our special operators had actually conducted informal joint campaigns against the Islamic State over the last couple of years, in which there was not, you wouldn't call it formal cooperation, but both our special operators and the CIA have figured out ways of tacitly cooperating with the Taliban against a common enemy, even in the last couple of years. So that precedent is worth keeping in mind.
Right. Okay, well, Jeff, I think we should probably open up the discussion to the audience. So why don't you take over?
So Frank and Philip, thank you very much. And we'll do just that. I'm watching the clock. We have almost 25 minutes for discussion. So raise your hand using the raised hand function, or catch my eye, or my colleague Michelle Hi will bring to my attention that you're waiting to speak or ask. I'm looking at chat and I'm seeing Sean Maloney, and I want to offer you the microphone unless you were just making a question for the group internally. Sean, if you're there, would you like to speak and pose your question?
Yeah, can everybody hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Yeah.
And Sean, tell us who you are, please.
Dr. Sean Maloney, Royal Military College. I was the Canadian Army's historian for the war in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2014. And this is an excellent discussion. I'm finding it very, very insightful. I really would like everybody's opinion on the role of Pakistan or interests in Pakistan in disrupting this project, because we regularly encountered this problem in the South, particularly in the 2006 to 2011 period. And I've been tracking what's been going on for the past 2 months now, and I'm seeing indicators of the same thing. So my question would be, can we discuss what everybody thinks the role of Pakistan or influencers that it plays?
Well, I'm happy to discuss that. No, it was always a problem. When I was there in 2003 and in Kandahar, I talked to the 05, American 05 there, and he was already complaining about the cross-border raids from Pakistan. The role of the Quetta Shura was already obvious back then, all of that. So, but this goes to emphasize how fundamentally unsound from a geopolitical point of view it was to try to maintain a long-term American military commitment there. By the beginning of the Obama administration, every single neighboring country was hostile to the presence of the United States. No exceptions. The transits into Afghanistan through Russia and Central Asia had been cut off. So the only supply lines you had, the only landlines into Afghanistan were through Pakistan, which was hosting the Taliban. So it's as if you're waging a war against the Viet Cong inside South Vietnam with supply lines that run through North Vietnam. Maybe literally, it's as if we in the Viet Cong would take turns using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to run our supplies to the south.
It's just
that
was exactly what we saw.
Completely absurd situation geopolitically. Yep. So then you have to ask yourself fundamentally, this situation is unsound unless you get some sort of modus vivendi with Pakistan, or you can get the security condition to a point where you can leave it to the people in the region to sort out their enemies. And you think you can get things to a manageable point. It's, again, when I step back, and you have to take a global perspective on threats to the United States, and then the comparative advantage of the United States in addressing threats that were concentrated in, from our point of view, really in the northwest frontier and in 2 provinces in eastern Afghanistan. So, and if you analyze that from a global point of view and you look at how completely unsound the geopolitical position was of the United States in that country, where by the Obama administration, it cost us $1 million per soldier per year, as a rough rule of thumb for how much it costs to maintain people in Afghanistan. $1 million per soldier per year. You have to then make some broad strategic judgments about what to do. And now Pakistan's a part of that. Pakistan, by the way, is itself a broken and perhaps failing state. It's been teetering along. One of the striking geopolitical shifts in the last 10 years is actually the increasing distance of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, now increasingly distant from Pakistan. For those who follow the 80s and 90s, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan were super tight. The Saudis were building the madrasas, all the rest of it. The key thing in the recent years is the Saudis have been distancing themselves from the Pakistanis, whom they increasingly regard as hopeless. And the Saudis find it more profitable and advantageous to build relationships across the Indian Ocean with India, and even at times with Israel, than with a country like Pakistan, though the Saudis still occasionally give Pakistan a little financial assistance to help them avert complete state bankruptcy. But Pakistan, in turn, has moved now into the geopolitical orbit of the China, Russia, Iran, anti-American entente. So from a geopolitical point of view, Pakistan's position has shifted significantly in the last 20 years, and the Saudi position has shifted significantly. And I think in a way, Pakistan has chosen the bed in which it wishes to lie. And we should basically walk away from that particular bedroom and let the people who live in that room sort out their future relations. I think that they'll find that very interesting.
Thanks very much.
I would just add that Americans have been aware for many, many years that the Taliban were succeeding only because of the safe haven that Pakistan was giving them. And I think we ran into the repeated problem that we have very limited influence. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, people saying, well, let's just cut them off and force them to stop providing that support. We tried that once before after they exploded their first nuclear weapon. We embargoed them, and it didn't make any difference because they had other sources of support, and we eventually gave up and then returned to trying to bribe them with with various kinds of assistance. And so I think that geopolitical condition that Philip just described explains why we had so little influence in that country.
But I noticed in the chat, incidentally, that a lot of people basically are tearing their hair in puzzlement at why the United States just didn't leave earlier and make the decisions and do this in an orderly way, and instead just kept kicking the can down the road. It's basically since Obama, no administration wanted to face the nightmare that Joe Biden has just experienced the last 2 weeks. They all saw that possible nightmare and they said that nightmare will not happen on my watch. And so it's cheaper and easier to defer and kick the can down the road to somebody else. Now, I'm not getting into the issue of could the Biden administration have handled it better or worse, but that's a different set of issues from in terms of the immediate handling of the last 6 months. But that's the dynamic over the last 8 years. It's hugely difficult to wind these things down. You invest a lot of status, prestige in a situation, and so it's hard to wind them up because we prefer to ignore the risks until they blow up in our cities. And then once you've wound them up, it's hard to wind them down because there's a lot of inertia and you don't want to act as if you're being complacent and you don't want to take the risk that something then might go wrong and make you look bad. In a way, there's kind of the path of least resistance, both is to do little, and then the path of least resistance is to not wind it down.
Yeah, actually, Ann Coulter just tweeted a day or so ago that Joe Biden's had the balls to do something that Trump repeatedly promised but was never able to carry off. So there you have it.
No, and people kept arguing that, hey, it's kind of stable. We can keep them from losing. Okay, so, many thousands of Afghans are dying every year, but not too many Americans. Costs us a few $1 billion a year. Now, Biden inherited a situation, though, in which he would have had to tear up the peace deal that Trump signed with the Taliban in order to renew and redouble our presence. If he had not withdrawn American troops on schedule, he would have been tearing up that deal. They then would have gone into their fighting season with another series of attacks on Americans. And meanwhile, the Afghan government was not in a steady state equilibrium. Its position was continuing to slowly erode. So it's not like you could have just maintained the exact same level of effort and gotten the same effect for indefinite. And more thousand, anyway, that's the situation they faced. They made the choices they made. You can then have an argument as to whether those choices were either profoundly right, which I think is my view, and should have been made many years ago. Well, 7 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. And then you can have another argument as to whether, having made that strategic decision, they executed that decision in the best way possible under the circumstances they faced. And people will look into that. And I don't know enough about the details to have a confident opinion about that. But I think we can shed some light in our conversation about how to put Afghanistan in perspective with the broader role the United States has played in Islam's wars over the last 20 years, and also noticing some core things that have actually been done well, even amidst all these battering headlines.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's go to you, Matilda, our colleague in Europe, who I imagine is in Norway today, but you'll tell us where you are, Matilda. Welcome, and we'll hear from you.
You hear me?
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear, good. I'm Matilda Fasting. I'm in Oslo, and papers are full of Afghanistan also here. I just posted a question about something maybe a little bit more positive, if anything, because this situation is just so terrible, and all the news are just coming out, and it's just terrible, and probably it's going to be a crisis of people going out of Afghanistan and all those things, and lately also the terrors at the airport. But what are the positive things that have come out of this 20 years of presence? There must have been something. And if there are something, are there any chances that these things could be important in building Afghanistan in the future for the Afghans themselves? I know that you, Frank, wrote something about that in your blog, but you might like to elaborate a little and maybe also ask the question to both of you.
Yeah, well, actually, Phil referred to this, but the United States effort brought about this really amazing social transformation in Afghanistan. It's a much more urbanized country than it was 20 years ago. You know, the city of Kabul went from about 500,000 to well over 3 million today. The number of people attending primary school increased by a factor of 10 over the same period. You know, almost 40% of those students are women. You have a very small, but you do have a, you know, significant urban middle class of Afghans that are reasonably well educated. You know, not a big enough middle class to really sustain, I think, a democracy, but you know, they're there, and I think that the Taliban is going to have this. You know, in a way, it's a little bit like what happened after the Allies conquered Germany, that they're all of a sudden in charge of running this country, and they discover that they don't know how to do that, and they're therefore going to have to rely on a lot of the people that are left over from the old regime. And you know, I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I think the Taliban have already, you know, kind of announced an amnesty for civil servants of certain categories because they recognize that they really are not capable of, you know, running the kind of modern society and you know, in many ways more culturally diverse society that Afghanistan represents today. But I don't know, Phil, do you have other?
I actually, I think those are nice comments, Frank. It's worth noting quite a lot of the help on the human development stuff that Frank just emphasized. And again, I'd single out education, electricity, public health. 3 crude indexes, but you can kind of measure those 3 things. A lot of the key help was not just from the United States. In fact, some of the most effective programs were the ones run by the World Bank, at least in the early years that I knew best. Quite a number of foreign governments and foreign nonprofits and NGOs did some really good work on the human development side. And he's right. The Taliban have come to a different country. By the way, a lot of people in Afghanistan are so desperate for the wars and the fighting to stop. There is such a deep, desperate hunger for peace in the country among many, many people. What I think they're going to find is they've got a country now that is much different than the country of 20 years ago and much improved on many human development scales. And mostly the Taliban don't want to roll all that back. They're going to have a lot of trouble governing the country and will need some sort of ethnic coalition to do it, which they're trying to patch together. They have a population that's desperately tired of war. The overwhelming majority wants to go back, yet their economy is 80% dependent on foreign aid, which foreign governments are now manipulating in different ways. Against that, they're going to try to find a way forward. You're going to have a substantial minority of the population that's youthful, that have known nothing but war their whole lives, that are tempted by nihilistic despair and an addiction to the world of violence, including a world of suicide bombings, which didn't exist in Afghanistan 20 years ago, or even maybe 10 years ago so much. That's their challenge now, in order to try to reconceive a future. And yes, the Taliban will want to insist on Islamic law, on some respect for rural traditions. There are all sorts of tribal differences too that need to be reconciled. But overarching all of that are these compelling requirements and needs and conditions that Frank and I are trying to explain, and that are actually very interesting and very tragic, in which the United States and foreign governments may end up playing a larger role than they want to. Mostly the people who contributed foreign aid to Afghanistan would now prefer to have nothing to do with the country. and let Pakistan and China and Russia and Iran take charge of sorting out Afghanistan's future. The people who are running Afghanistan will soon realize the limits of help they can expect to receive from those sources. Then you're going to have an interesting dynamic happen. And I don't know how that story can play out. There's a possibility it could even play out constructively. There are a lot of other possibilities.
Yeah, there's an interesting policy choice that we face. You read these stories that say that there's maybe another 250,000 Afghans that want to leave the country now that are now trapped there, and whether there's something we can do for them. Now that would be an urgent problem if it were clear that the Taliban is going to be like the Khmer Rouge, and that they're going to unleash this, unbelievable wave of terror, striking back at anyone that had anything to do with the former government. If, however, they don't evolve in that direction and they actually, make the kinds of compromises that, we've been suggesting might be necessary to actually run the country, you have to ask yourself whether it's actually desirable to give that many people an exit option. I mean, apart from the impact on Europe and the United States and the other countries that would be receiving these people, basically what you're talking about is taking this entire educated, nascent middle class out of the country. And if it turns out to everybody's pleasant surprise that the Taliban is not the Khmer Rouge, then, that might not be the right choice. And it's terrible for somebody sitting in the safety of Palo Alto, California, to say that, these people should remain. But I think that this is really a problem that's confronted very many places where, the presence of an exit option really means that societies don't have the human resources. This is a big problem in Eastern Europe right now. Societies don't have the resources to actually solve their own problems.
So, gentlemen and colleagues, we are really just about out of time. May I ask Philip and Frank a concluding question? Philip, you first, if you would. We've devoted a lot of time, and understandably so, to 9/11 follow-on in Afghanistan in the last minutes. Could you share a thought or two, if you're inclined, about what else we should be watching as we enter this fall season? Philip, you wrote a very interesting report, co-authored with Bob Blackwell, as I recall, on Taiwan earlier this year. Seems ages ago. It was probably all about 5 or 6 months ago. And Frank, similarly, you're involved in lots of issues, global perspective, including Ukraine. You just spoke at a Crimea platform about a week ago. Could we hear just a comment or two about other things we ought to have on our screen? Philip?
Well, just the number one crisis in the world is the pandemic. The pandemic has probably caused more than 10 million excess deaths in the last year. And by this time next year, it could kill 10 million more. It's the biggest crisis it's the biggest crisis in the United States, and it's the biggest crisis in the world. And I want to stress, this is a crisis on which the United States is still a superpower, still an indispensable source of global leadership. So if you start with that premise and that perspective, I think that's constructive. We did comment earlier this year about Taiwan because from a point of view of a flashpoint for possibility for a danger of war, Taiwan was and is, I think, number one for a danger of major war. Not the only one, but I still think that's true in the period of, say, the next 3 to 5 years, maybe less.
Philip, thank you. Frank?
Well, yeah, President Zelensky is actually coming here to Stanford and will be speaking tomorrow morning. There are other issues in American foreign policy. I personally, although I supported President Biden, am quite disappointed in his policy towards Ukraine, because it seems to me that it's really the frontline country in this global struggle with, Putin-esque kleptocracy. And, the Nord Stream 2 decision and basically a very standoffish posture towards Ukraine suggests that, he's, despite talking about democracy and values underlying American foreign policy, is actually not, walking the walk. So we'll have to see how his meeting with Biden today goes, and whether that leads to, more engagement on the administration's part.
Well, Frank, thank you very much. To all of you who spent time today, I am certain I speak for you in viewing this, experiencing this as exceptionally useful, interesting, and profitable. If you would, and you're inclined and your camera is off, flip it on just for a moment so that we can say hi and bye to everybody. It's kind of nice in these times where everything is by Zoom. Good to see you all. Thank you. Philip Zelikow, Frank Fukuyama, what a fabulous, stimulating, challenging conversation. Thank you both, guests of honor. Thanks everybody for your time today.
Oh, and thanks for hosting us.
Great pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.